IRC and everywhere else. I am the shit as well. Thank you very well. Go on a quick overview for the talk. Basically, going to describe what DNSMasq is, some of the benefits of local DNS caching, and why you might want to do that on a home network. Basic configuration and a couple tricks. One of which isn't going to work on this network, but I played with it last night and I was like, sweet, we can go do this, but currently it's not going to. But I'll give the overview of what it is, and then, like I mentioned, a little demonstration. So, basically what is it? It's a streamlined DNS forwarder and caching server, and it also has a built-in DHCP server, which is kind of interesting because you can have it automatically update based on, if hosts that are automatically being configured, you can have it update its DNS entries, and then which is cool because then you can access by host names versus having to throw that into the server or use some external thing to actually keep them in sync. And compared to like bind, it's a lot easier. And a lot of times bind is way overkill for a home network or a small network even. And it was designed mostly for small networks, so if you're going to roll it out to a big enterprise, you're going to want to use something more like bind. But apparently it can scale to like several 100,000 hosts on network. So I mean, I wonder what they mean by small network, because
Well, I can tell you we're up to 300.
Okay. So, and I know it's been around for a long time, like 10 plus years or something. So, and it's not like a new product that just came out yesterday. So you can probably trust it for even enterprise use. But as I mentioned, it's designed primarily for simple DNS services, but you can use it both as a combined DHCP server or one or the other. You can configure it to shut off DNS and just run as a DHCP server if you want to. Like I mentioned, think bind, but with DHCP and without all the hassle. The next slide, why would you want to cache DNS? As you can imagine, as the first step on most networking apps, you want to look up what your host names are to identify what the network address is before you can start communication. So the less times you actually have to make those requests, especially frequent requests like to blogs, Facebook, blah, blah, especially on bigger networks where a lot of people check the same news sites or do stuff at work that they shouldn't, stuff like that. You don't want it necessarily to be adding to your overall bandwidth by making a series of requests to the same place. And browsers and computers themselves also do some local caching, but sometimes it's nice to also have another computer dedicated to that and handling it. And it's also good on a home network because if you have multiple machines, it makes it a little bit peppier by not having to make the requests as often. And I've noticed by adding it to mine, it seemed to be a little bit faster. Maybe it's just more of a gut feeling, but I haven't actually benchmarked anything. But it seems faster.
What's the value of that over something like CD? The network services caching, do you know? Server caching NSCD?
I haven't tried it, to be honest. So maybe you can enlighten us.
Well, I can tell you what NSCD is,
Okay.
but I just didn't know if there was a value to it. NSCD provides local caching to hosts for similar things with DNS.
Okay.
And you can time out anywhere from 6 minutes to whatever you want. That's the default. So.
Okay.
Is it local machine?
It can be. It can also be. It's not. There's no like you can't query it. Like you can cache it in a server, which is actually what I was looking for an answer. But I wondered if there's other reasons.
Yeah. And I've really only used it for my home network use. I know some of its benefits are more on the forward routing and stuff, where you could have it set up to forward to another server that's more robust, like bind or whatever, for a certain network, while it's handling all the caching for the other network. And I'll show you in the configuration a little bit that you can tag networks and apply certain rules to those networks, like say a color, if you will, red and blue network, which is kind of cool. especially if you were, only had a few hosts and you were just mapping all of your Etsy host files across and you just rsync them. This can provide a little bit more wildcard support and things like that. Or I'll mention a little bit later, you can also map like whole parts of a domain to a certain IP address without any of the lookup. Say in the case of development, you want all of your vhosts to match a certain thing. Anyway, reduced latency obviously will mean faster connections, but there is a big debate as what is the actual benefit, given the speed of networking and stuff now. But if for home users, a lot of them are using just their standard ISP name servers, and from a lot I've read, a lot of them aren't necessarily configured properly, and they also have a lot of traffic on them, given that everybody just leaves it default, the majority of people. And you can get some advantages to lookups by making less requests to them, only when necessary, or bypassing them for better service, and caching it locally yourself. Some basic features that it has. Like I mentioned, you can use it for simple DNS configuration for your local network, and handling a central location for all of your nodes rather than having to push configs to each machine. And by default, it reads from Etsy host on the machine it's running, but you can disable that. You can provide an alternate file for mappings. You can also script that, and have it read from a bunch of different things. And it caches all the standard records, like your A record and quad A for IPv6, MX, name server, and pointer. So if you're doing a reverse lookup from the IP address and want to get what the host name is, it can also manage that. And I've read, and I haven't used it, but it can, since it supports both IPv4 and 6, it can be used as like a bridge to pass some of the mappings between networks. So if your one network only supports IPv6 and you need to communicate, you wouldn't have to set up something differently. I'm not sure what configuration you have to do to get that working, but I read that it's possible. And you can forward DNS based on domain, and I'll show you an example of that. Basically, you could set up, for instance, a subdomain of your, say your company has a domain, a subdomain of that you wanted to run locally. You could have that subdomain be local and the rest of it just pass on as usual to the overall DNS server. It's integrated DHCP support. Obviously handles static and dynamic leases, and it also supports rules based on wildcards and things like that, which is kind of cool. And it can handle one or multiple networks and IP ranges, and configure machines based on that. As I mentioned earlier, as a cool benefit of the integration, you can have it automatically add DNS entries for hosts from DHCP. And there could be potentially a security risk with that, if somebody, depending on how you set it up, if in the general case, if you wanted to have any new machine that came on to use its network name as the entry in the DNS, if you had certain rules based on that, you could potentially have higher privileges on another network if you identify it that way. However, you can also restrict that and say, this network address has to be this. You can also spoof that. But the configuration's there. It's kind of cool. Yeah. You wanna have a question?
Can you restrict based on host name? It's configured host name and MAC address.
Correct. And you can also do like wildcards based on the MAC address, and vendor specific things like Linux or BSD or what have you. And that's based on the defined codes for the manufacturers on the first couple types.
Can you set up like a range of via MAX with specific numbers?
Right.
And then just have wildcard after a certain point?
And then say you wanted to handle all the Windows machines to go on this network and have IPs on that, you could set it up really easily to have on the front. And there are some like workarounds for like old machines like Windows 2000 that had to have a few extra things after, like passing an extra like magic value for it to work. And it has support for that, so it's like you'd set up a rule if it's win too big and pass this byte whenever it authenticates, things like that. So it's kind of cool. By default, it just handles unqualified names, so you don't have to have the full domain on there. And that doesn't really matter if you're setting up the domain, the search domain anyway. That's standard because most people don't have to type it out if that's part of their search path. But it can support the fully qualified domain name. And I had to set it up as unqualified, so I can just type in, this host all along, not deal with like naming a domain. But we'll just go over a little bit of the config basics. You can listen, obviously, on the defined interface that you want, and you specify bind interfaces, I think, to actually say that, hey, I want to use that other config, and listen on just 127.0.1 or 1.1 or what have you. If you leave that off by default, it'll listen on all of them. And I read that there's a benefit to doing that because it will check to see what's the active network at the time, and it's listening on both, and it will pick whichever one is actually responding and serve up over that. So if there's a benefit to that or not. But and obviously you can set the port default 53. If you set it to 0, it will disable the DNS server. So if you wanted to just run the DHCP, disable both, there's no sense in running the server, obviously. But, so if you wanted to run either or, that's the way to do it. And there's a process. By default, if you run it as root, it will drop down to nobody, but you can specify a different user. And I believe you got to create those, the user and group first before you can set those. I don't think it creates them for you, but pretty easy. One of the interesting configs is the concurrent DNS query. So if, by default it's 150, which for most small networks is probably sufficient, and that's the number of concurrent connections to name servers that it's fetching information for. And if you went higher than that, especially on smaller machines like or embedded processors, then you're going to run out of connections and things like that. But it supports. But by default, I think the 150 is pretty good. The host cache size, that's a number of hosts that keep in memory at any given time. And 150 is pretty good as well. You can pick it up to 1,000, but you need a little bit more memory, obviously. But your mileage may vary. If you wanted the fully qualified domain names, you set domain needed, which means that if you don't have a domain on it, it will return it in the next domain and not found. And bogus priv is another one, which I don't remember the specifics, but basically it's for reverse lookup. If I remember right, if it doesn't can't find an IP on it to reverse, then it also returns in X domain. Here's one of the tricks that I wanted to kind of show, but it's not working. It might be that the router itself is rewriting and returning the correct domain record. But anyway, what's cool about this is if you set it up locally, say you wanted to run OpenDNS, you use your ISP servers, blah blah blah. Well, they used to be a little bit better, but now they got all spammy, and basically if you type a domain wrong, rather than their name servers returning an X domain, and then you'd see like page cannot be displayed or what have you in your browser. What happens is they return an A record, which is basically the IP address as if it worked, and they pass your query string or the domain name that you're looking for to a redirect, so when your browser requests it, it does a 302 with your domain as a result, and then it goes to a search page basically. So rather than being able to see that, hey, it doesn't exist, you get a crappy search page. And maybe that's not as bad a thing if it weren't for the convenience of a browser bar where you're searching for stuff and it automatically Googles it for you. which the browser relies on the NX domain to see, okay, this wasn't an actual domain, these were search terms that need to go to Google. So that was one thing I noticed when I was using it back in the day. It's like, what the hell? This is broken now. The browser doesn't work. So what this does is the IP I put here is actually what the static IP returns in the A record for OpenDNS that they say is the right IP for any bad domain. And what that does is when you're using the name server DNSMasq, what it'll do is if it matches that IP address in a condition where it says it's an A record, but it's actually a domain cannot be found, it will give you the right response. So your browser will start working and everything works as it's supposed to. So I wanted to showcase that, but it's actually giving the correct response even if I'm ping their server right from this one. So, but at home I tried it and that wasn't the case. It actually gave back the other one. So if you enable it, it starts working. So it's kind of cool. But we won't get to see that today. Another cool trick, as I mentioned, was say if you're a developer, you want to set up some vhosts so that each of your sites has a .dev or .local domain rather than your .com or net or whatever you're working on. Typically, what you do is you just add a shit long result in your Etsy hosts. So for every domain, it's mapped to your vserv. And the problem with that is it doesn't support wildcards, and you have to keep updating every time you add a new one. Granted, you have to add, a new config in your Apache or your Nginx, but it sucks to have to also update your Etsy host file. Anyway, so if you're running DNSMasq locally, you can set up this rule, which is address equals, and each of the domains you can actually separate multiple ones with slashes. So if you only wanted one, you just do /dev/ whatever, and it will map it to the IP address that you specify. And what's cool about that is it won't actually try to look it up. It will always map it and skips all the lookup. So you don't have to wait for it to go all the way back up to the name server, tell you that, hey, that's not a valid domain, and return the result. It just instantly will give you back what you want. Another example that uses that is if you wanted to block ads that are specific to a domain, say by rerouting it to a local server that doesn't exist for the ads. And I don't know how scalable that would be so well.
We used to do things, like Google has ad block, right?
Right.
So my boss at Google Labs created a host file with every address.
Everything.
With 127.0.0.1 next to it. And if you go on Google and actually look that up, there's like a bunch of people now that actually maintain
block list.
Yeah, and you can just download it, put it in your Etsy hosts,
Nice.
and it blocks everything.
So yeah, you could update it.
So you don't have to have a plugin on Firefox or whatever, right? So
or other browsers that don't have
they
those.
should do it in DNSMasq.
Yeah. Try to look like. Another, if you wanted to, like block foreign domains or something, but there's so many.
It's no fun. Oh, with word or code. Okay.
Yeah.
I see
Maybe
where
we do
you're going
that.
with that.
So yeah, so that's kind of a cool thing. And if you don't want the actual host part of the domain, then you leave off the dot, so it's just net, and it will imply that .net. It's not a wild card like net within the name. It's just at the end of it, so you're not going to get like some false positives where it's remapping something else that's legitimate. Because I've tried. So that's good for it.
I think I missed that, but like the example in the middle, what domain is it actually matching if you type, what domain is it matching when you type that domain into your address bar?
It's matching the last part, so the actual .com up there.
Oh,
We
so
call that
anything
the
not
top
that.
level
not
domain,
local.
the TLD on it, top level
Yeah.
domain.
Interesting.
Yeah. So when you want a long domain, it has to be more of the full domain. So if you want just a subdomain across all of them, it wouldn't quite work. You have to have the host name and top level domain. Exactly. And so it's kind of handy. I don't think that. Oh, the other thing is if you want to match everything, it's the pound symbol. that can be useful in other things. So you want to match like just this and everything else right here. That's a little more useful for the forwarding rules, where you wanted to match the one domain and everything else, do as normal. An example, if you're like, say you got dragons.example.net, you've got, I don't know if you guys noticed before, it's actually, I went too far back. That's right. Stupid animations. Next time I won't add them. So anyway, that was address. The forwarding config is server. So if you wanted to forward based on a domain, and what the top one says is for the dragons subdomain, route it through the name server at that address, as opposed to mapping, returning an A record for this domain. It returns, another. It actually forwards it to an upstream.
How to do that in bind.
So this would be the upstream name server, if you will. So it should be transparent to the user. And as for the other one, that says for everything else for that domain, do as usual. So use the regular upstream provider. And that's going to be either from Etsy Resolve if you leave the configs by default, or whatever you set in the config, or through kernel file. So kind of cool. And here's the, that was nice. It's nice and slow. Exactly. Okay, so there's the DHCP. They're not super cryptic, but if you read it, the top one, it says, for this network, give it a 12-hour lease and tag it with the red. And that part you can leave off. If you want to identify or set some rules to apply to the network, you got to tag it with some sort of identifier. And the second one's going to be blue with a different range and infinite lease, or as far out as you can. And the next one, that's one where you could identify by a MAC address that matches exactly, and it also tags it with a host name that's identified by that. And that doesn't set it in the DNS unless you specify it to actually use that to add it automatically. So just like using bind and like another DHCP server, like ISCP or whatever, you would have to update them to match, but they wouldn't necessarily have to be the same thing. But I kind of like them to match up and have it automatic, so I don't have to manage stuff. But anyway, that sets up a static IP for that particular MAC address. So if you, like a lot of people, really wanted to use DHCP, so you didn't have to set up on every box static IPs, you could just have it served up from DHCP, but have them static basically.
But sorry,
That's
that
the third one.
That doesn't give it a DNS entry of birth.
Right.
Does or does not?
It does not, and I would have to look up, but I think there's a config that you can have it automatically updated. So that's by default, it's what's in your Etsy host config is actually what ends up in those entries, as opposed to what's in the DHCP configs. So really, if you assign, say, Bert to 10.05, and you had another mapping of like Ernie or whatever, then it would be Ernie in DNS, but Bert would be identified in its DHCP database. So if you looked in, in its log, then it would say Bert as opposed to Ernie. But it's kind of confusing. You probably should set them the same.
Okay, Bert, you're confused.
Right.
So the red-blue tagging that you're doing there, that's an arbitrary string that's just
Right.
important to the config, not
Exactly.
external.
You have to tag it if you want to apply some of the cool things like, hey, for this one, apply them, put them on this network,
Like the last one.
like the last one. So anything matching that MAC address would be set up on the blue network, as opposed to either one. And I would imagine if you have the two, you would have to identify either one to be able to set up the rules. Otherwise, I haven't tried, but if I would guess, if it even works, it would probably be the first one. to whatever one it decides to default. But there's like two ways you can either set it up in these different rules to say net and then apply a tag. There's another way which I haven't shown, but basically you can do it either or, so whatever your preference is. You need to say on this network, apply to this or vice versa. So I've only shown this because the slide only had so many things, but there's some pretty cool things. I'll show you when get in the demonstration. So for the local dev, pretty simple. Go back one. Local is another alias for server. If you wanted to do a forwarding rule, so it's as simple as that for doing both dev and local. Say if your development and to block ads. Here's some others.
So you mentioned earlier that you couldn't do subdomain server, but with address you can.
Actually, both.
As a field as well, but
right. So my
that would be a second one.
so say you want to do blah.star, if you will, it doesn't work. Like I don't think it supports star.
Oh,
We
I
wanted
see what you're saying, so it's the other way
everything
around, okay.
across. It actually goes from the right to the top lower.
Right, which makes sense.
So if you did net, every .net would actually map.
Makes sense, okay.
And then if you wanted a little bit more refined, then you would add to it from there.
So it's like generic to specific.
Exactly.
And in order to match subdomains on DoubleClick, can you do the pound in it?
Yeah, I think it's pound, but they might actually in that context. That might make sense. I haven't tried it. But what I was the one site I was looking at, they use pound it for your routing. Say if you wanted to say use the default name server. So as opposed to having to define that IP to say wildcard, if you will, in that spot. So that makes sense. I wanted to go through these real quick just to see that there's a ton that you can do. You can set it up to not poll at the resolve. If you have a fixed list and you don't want it polling every time it changes, and maybe that's not a big deal because it's whenever the timestamp changes. You can set that up. You can also define the upstream servers, or by default it will read as a result. And these will actually go in addition to what resolve has, unless you say no poll and no resolve. And you can also set up forwarding specific for the reverse mapping as well. So if you have a use for that, you have address, there's some servers. I believe all of these configs can also be command line parameters as well. So if you prefer that, it should be pretty close. So where you set the user and group and the interfaces. And you can also do like everything except this. If you had a bunch of cards, I set this basically to turn off DHCP. But you could also run both at the same time. This will give you additional host files. Rather host names to use for your mapping, in addition to Etsy host. And you can either use both at the same time, and I believe this file will overwrite whatever's an Etsy host, so you have your primary and then whatever else overwrites it, or you can use one or the other.
Does it choose them in order of precedence?
Right, I think it's in the order that they're defined in the file, actually.
So your first file, it'll take over your second?
I believe it's the second, so like if you define an additional file, then it will overwrite whatever was in Etsy host, if it's the same exact name. Here's some domains that you can also set them specific for certain subnets. So not only does it need to match like this and that, you can say it matches a domain, or sorry, a subnet. And here's kind of the DHCP rules. You set up ranges for your network, and down here is where you actually have tagged it. Here's your host that sets up a static entry. This one identifies it as Fred for this. Release time. There's a ton of defaults that you can use. most. The ID is actually for, I believe, the network name. So if you want to match on that, you can apply the rules to it. What else do we got here? Here's the vendor class. So put all Linux machines on the red network, basically. And I think I didn't see it in the man page, but somewhere is documented what all of the vendor class strings are. So imagine they're pretty standard.
The DHCP server also covers all that. In its documentation.
Gotcha. And as for DHCP options, those are like your, when it configures the machine, what the name server is, the gateway, subnet mask, things like that. And they'll let you either do it the more verbose way that's easier to understand, or they have numbers. And I set mine up like this, not realizing it later that I was like, ah, crap.
What does 3
That would have
mean?
been nice. You know,
That's
so.
what I was looking at going, what does 3 mean? I gotta look that up.
Yeah. Even so, as long as you left the comments on there, it wouldn't be too
Well, I
bad.
mean,
but
commonly
it's-
when you're doing automated installs, you
Yeah.
usually use several options. And so
Exactly. Having them more verbose is a little
Yeah.
nicer. So it looks like you can also combine different options. So say you wanted to apply this option, the red network, to just this. And so rather than having to do it all on individual lines, you could combine them. So that's about it, unless you guys want me to keep going through here, but most of it's pretty much the same. So, and
So just out of curiosity, what is the IPv6 support like? I saw IPv6 mentioned very quickly.
I haven't looked a whole lot, but let's see here. I imagine it supports the addresses as they
it looks
are.
like it supports the same way.
Yeah. So you could set up wildcards just the same way in between these,
Okay.
and so forth.
I'm just kind of curious how it actually.
This one I saw was interesting.
I will. I'll have to play with it.
Do you know what use this would be? I saw this last night. The alias basically rewrites the IP address for an upstream IP. So if an A record comes back for, say, Google, you could rewrite it to something else from that.
Reverse proxies.
Yeah.
And actual just like SOX proxies and stuff.
So you could push it through your firewall or something for the request.
Force them to go through a particular machine rather
Right.
than the network. I'm not sure how it would change it back, that sort of thing.
Right. But yeah, so kind of interesting. They have some different things. There's also I read that there's TFTP support, but I never use that. It's for
TFTP's rad. It's useful for installing with
gotcha. And for like small embedded systems and installation.
I guess.
Cisco hardware, you can back up all your stuff straight.
On network devices.
So this fully supports that too, I heard. So if that's useful.
Yeah, probably in for Pixie boot and things like that. Probably supposed to. I would hope so.
Yeah. So what I was gonna showcase is basically if you did something like that, and I'm gonna specify the name server that it would give the A record for OpenDNS, because I have the upstream server set to them right now. But on this network, it must rewrite it properly or something, because it's not giving me that. But at home, it actually says that. It says in X domain yet, it gives me an A record back. That's how I actually look to see how that.
Yeah.
And
That's not cool at
a
all.
lot of ISPs have done that as well, because they get like ad traffic for everybody misselling domains and domain squatters and things like that. So, so just find a DNS provider that's not a jackhole.
Or run your own.
Run your own. Exactly. So kind of cool. If, as I showed earlier, blob.local, it rewrites really anything with local or dev to that. And I'm putting that on there to say, use that name server. It's not actually passing over, just types back to it. It looks like it, but anyway, so rather than looking it up, it maps everything.
Is it only running on your local host?
Right.
Okay, so you don't have bound to your IP.
Right. So I'm running it in the VM. I don't have it on the Mac side, but it could if I installed it in there. But that's about it. Kind of wish I could show the DX thing. I was gonna like
Yeah, that would be neat.
pop open the HTTP client and see what it does. But anyway, so that's about it.
Quick question.
What's up?
Do you know of any DNS caching program that will, for certain servers, it will pass out an A record just based, like round robin or something, just a different A record just randomly?
I'm not sure what you're asking.
So if you requested the
Domain to A record, it'll just pass out, it'll pass a random A record to you.
So you're talking about more like a round robin configuration?
Right.
Multiple servers.
Like a load balancer?
That's what Google does.
And sometimes they do that evil, and they just give you an IP that could be anywhere in the whole world.
right
And
rather than
you want
closer to
to
the
deploy
geo.
Is there any program that will just say, I just want the IPs that are local, or kind of be a little more intelligent?
I
You know,
don't
do a
know
trace
if
route
you
and
could
then-
do it with this, because it's like one-to-one mapping. It doesn't seem to support multiple.
And kind of get like a preferred
Yeah.
mapping or something?
Would a load balancer work with that? Like a
Well,
DNS
I
load
mean, Google
balancer?
does it with Bind, and they have
Oh, okay.
some
Well, that-
scripts on top of that handle it. I don't know exactly what.
That's fishing out there, not routing.
Yeah.
Right. And I think you're talking about having a caching server that figures out this is really the IP address because it's a local regional address.
Yes,
Right.
for companies that don't do it right, and they kind of
Based on your host
just
or
give
something.
you a random IP.
Yeah, they just do round robin and they're done. That's the problem, is you need to tell them when they're on. But it's not easy to solve that problem.
Right. And then when you like dig or whatever, Google, it dumps like a ton of like records that are available.
Well, there is,
Just
I mean,
selects the top
NSCD, and it sounds like DNSMasq probably does it. NSCD is not actually a server, it's just a client component. Which is why I asked what the difference was, because NSCD will cache things locally. So if you get if you can control what, where if you know where it's coming from, you can have it locally on your phone, and you can do the same thing on DNSMasq. You
Just set up a
those
route
records.
for that.
Yeah, so like when you get one that's not where you want it, you just try to throw it away and go get another one. Keep digging until you get the right one. And use GeoIP or something and figure out it's usually local.
Or faster, or whatever your
Yeah,
options
whatever
are.
those things are. That's a pretty sound.
Yeah. That's to kill you. Yeah, so that's it.